Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street, London. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Alexandra Durnford. So Alexandra Durnford is an executive coach, and she founded a famous organization called Byron and Wilf. I'm just going to read from the website. It says, I founded Byron and Wilf to coach clients to think, communicate, and behave in a way that improves their ability to manage themselves and others more effectively, achieve their professional and personal goals, and reach new levels of confidence and performance at work. So let me start by asking you, Alexandra, there seems to be a bit of a resistance to the notion of executive coaching and the notion that it's quite an important thing and it's a thing that exists and can be helpful to people. Tell us a bit about what your understanding of what executive coaching is and what your thoughts are about the idea there might be some resistance to it, the notion that people could benefit from executive coaching. In fact, we all could, but there's a resistance to that idea. What are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are, initially, luckily, there isn't huge resistance. Otherwise, I would not be gainfully employed. Luckily, not everybody's resistant. But I think there is possibly a preconception that coaching in the business context is remedial. So you have a problem, we need you to fix it. And unless that happens, something bad is going to happen. So I think that is changing, actually, and more professionals and businesses are seeing coaching in the same way in a business context as you would if you were, a sports person who was at the top of their game, but they still had a coach. So I think it is shifting a little. But initially, yes, quite often you get but is there something wrong with me? Why do I need coaching?
So we can all improve. I mean, yeah, we can all improve. I play a lot of tennis and I play a bit of golf and I play a sport called beach tennis. So the notion that we might need coaching in certain parts of our lives, like piano or tennis, and that we can improve, it seems, because I'm in the field, natural to me to think that we could improve in management, in our interpersonal relationships and the way we manage ourselves. Why do you think people are so resistant to the idea that we can benefit from coaching in our personal and psychological lives when they're very open to the idea that if you want to get better at tennis, in fact, it'd be a bit mad, the idea that you could get better at tennis without coaching? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the word is personal. So I think it feels personal, whereas I think if you're playing a sport, somehow that's an objective situation in which you're still there as a person, but what's being commented on is your skill or ability on hitting a ball back. Whereas in coaching, necessarily, it's about you. So as soon as you make it about somebody, then people become very, very defensive and they think, well, hold on a minute, what's wrong with me or what's right with me? And so I think probably that's fundamentally what the issue is. So in a way, as a coach, your job really is to sort of demystify that and help people understand that and the fact that we don't often get feedback about ourselves. We get feedback as we go through our professional career, but it tends to be about your technical delivery of a piece of work. It tends not to be behavioral unless there has been a major issue.
So let's talk a bit about that. You're right. People are very sensitive to feedback and people get very defensive. Yet we could all benefit from feedback. In my opinion, anyone who wants to be good at anything, let's take a very gory example. I see a lot of this. I specialized in eating disorders for a while. If you want to lose weight, the only way you're going to lose weight is by getting feedback on your performance. In other words, you're going to have to weigh yourself. And it's just amazing how many people want to lose weight, yet don't want to weigh themselves and discover the number is not the number they were hoping it was going to be, and getting feedback. So people are very defensive about any kind of feedback about themselves, in my experience. So tell us a bit about whether you agree with that and how do you break through their defensiveness?
So I think it's a fine line between not trying to create some sort of Pollyanna-ish approach, but using positive psychology to help people change something fundamentally about their behavior. So I probably wouldn't also weigh myself. I'd probably go on how my genes fit, which again is a different thing because it feels less judgmental, but the outcome's the same. But I think it's about saying to them, okay, well, look, this is your feedback. It's data. You can do with it what you like, but what is your perception of yourself? And And if that perception is different from the data you've received, then back to you. Would you like to change that perception? In which case, these are the kind of things we can do. Or are you happy with the way in which people perceive you? So I think a lot of it is about handing control and accountability back to the person and trying to remove any sense of judgment, because as soon as you judge somebody or ask somebody why, you're going to get a defensive response. You have to kind of remove that to enable them to think much more creatively and from a position of power and control rather than one of defense.
So how would you start a consultation in executive coaching? Because there's a big difference between someone choosing to come along because they've decided they want to improve some aspect of themselves and someone being told by someone in the office they have to go. Someone in human resources has said you've got to have executive coaching. So they're kind of there maybe a bit reluctantly and it wasn't their idea. Any thoughts about that and that difference?
Well, in executive coaching, certainly there is a definite framework that prevents you, hopefully, from being in a situation where somebody sitting in front of you doesn't want to be there. They may feel uncomfortable, but that's a different thing. So in exec coaching, certainly the first part of the process is a chemistry meeting. So maybe unlike therapy, if you're going to have a coach, you meet maybe 3 people who you think, could I bear to sit in a room with you for 90 minutes once a month at the very least to talk to you about some stuff that might run quite deep. And that chemistry meeting is really an opportunity for you to establish trust with your potential client. And if you can't establish the chemistry, then the coaching's not going to go ahead. So there's that as a kind of a first step. And then your role as the coach isn't there to judge or to validate the feedback someone has been given. It's worth saying that probably only about 20% of my work is in the realm of you've got a problem, you need to sort it out, and this is bad feedback. Most of the work I do is with people who are highly functioning and high performing and want to increase that. But for those where there is a fundamental problem in their behavior, then you have to establish that you are there to facilitate their process of changing that behavior if they want to. And step 1 is to establish chemistry and a good relationship, a sense of rapport with them. So then that prevents you, hopefully, from being in a situation where they're kind of sitting opposite you with their arms crossed saying, well, I don't want to be there. And if that happens, then actually you can't coach that person.
So let's talk a bit about this gory subject of getting feedback on our performance. You and I were having a chat the other day before we began this program to have a chat about what we could talk about. And we were discussing some anecdotal examples of the fact that people are very guarded. You have friends, but you're guarded. You have thoughts about how they could improve or where they've got problems. But particularly in Britain, we're not direct and we don't say anything. And we discussed a few examples. And I was thinking hard after our conversation about how, in a way, we get feedback on our performance. First of all, there's a group of people just not interested, right? But if you're neurotic like I am and anxious about yourself, you are interested. So a couple of things happened, which I think are examples. Because it's Christmas, the coaches at the local tennis center where I get my do a lot of tennis have decided, one of them, that they couldn't do the group coaching where they normally coach 24 people, and they're only going to coach 4 people next Monday. And I made the cut. I'm one of the 4 they came up to and said, would you like to be part of the group? And I'm thinking to myself, quite interesting. Why did they pick me? Right? That's telling me something about, hopefully, the coach quite likes me. And if I was one of the other 20 that were excluded or no one approached them, I'd be thinking, why was I not approached? So there's a lot of that going on in social life, isn't there? You hear about some party where all your friends got invited and you didn't get invited, and you're thinking, oh, is this a bit of feedback? So there's kind of exclusion, inclusion. Any other thoughts about how we get feedback? Because if you're very observant, you can get a bit of feedback, but you have to look for it, don't you? And a lot of people are just not looking for it. But in a way, feedback is kind of all around us, I think. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone says feedback's a gift, but in my experience, no one really wants to receive that particular gift, and they don't want to receive it in an unsolicited manner. So I think it comes back again to some level of contracting. If someone says to you, I'd really like to hear what you think about how I've done something, then they're inviting you to give them feedback. And the way in which that's received is predicated on the strength of your relationship with them. So I think there has to be a kind of a mutual understanding of positive intent. I'm not giving you feedback with a kind of pejorative judgment slammed in there as well. I'm giving you feedback because you've asked me to, or because it's part of a process, but I'm doing that from a position of positive intent, and I'm not going to make it personal. And I think what happens is ill-disciplined or lazy feedback is easy because you can easily do it in a personal way. Like, oh, you're really bad at that. Now, that then becomes a pejorative judgment about somebody, rather than when you're doing a presentation in front of 25 people, actually, the way in which you modulate your voice could be improved because that will help engagement in the room. So there's something about positive intent and tangibility in giving feedback. And both of those things mean that you can't do it quickly. So I think we sort of hold back because it's a thing. Because done quickly equals normally badly and badly received, but done well takes time and thought and discipline of language and establishment of rapport and contracting. And that, that takes time. And I think a lot of people feel as if they're asking too much when they ask for feedback.
Now, you did that very well. I'm very impressed with both phrases you used. Can we just run over that again? How you invite feedback. Could you tell us a bit about that? I was very impressed about the way you invite, because I think we need to learn how to invite feedback, don't we? I mean, we should ask for more of it, and it would help us. I often do it in a funny kind of way after tennis. We're going to use a lot of tennis analogies in this conversation, I'm afraid. Usually I'm
tell you now, I can't play.
Don't worry. Just as you understand the basis of the game. In doubles, and one of the things I'm very scared of is that because I'm passionate about winning and I'm hugely competitive, that once my partner starts hitting the ball into the net, which of course is the main reason if I am going to lose, I will lose. It's not because of anything to do with me, obviously. I start to get grumpy, and I try to hide the grumpiness, but I'm sure there's a cloud of simmering resentment hanging over me on the court, despite my best efforts. So usually at the end of the match, I always apologize. I always say, listen, I'm really sorry. I think I got a bit grumpy, and I'm sorry about that. I'm working on it. And usually what they say is, no, I didn't notice anything. And I'm not convinced that's entirely true. I think they're just being polite. So there's a thing going on there. Well, I'm kind of inviting feedback. And I do this after each consultation. Again, it's very interesting how rarely, the way I invite feedback after a consultation with a patient, I say, let's think about the work we've done together today. And can we think about a way that maybe I could improve the experience for next time? Is there anything I could do better? So that's a way, and I welcome your feedback on that way of asking for feedback, of giving them an open door, I hope, an opportunity to be negative about or say anything negative, because otherwise they probably wouldn't. Very rarely do I get anyone saying anything negative, interestingly. I don't know whether that's a bad sign or a good sign. Anyway, so tell us a bit about, again, how to invite feedback, because you did that really well. You much better phrasing than I use, I think.
So I think let's take the two examples you gave. So you gave us a tennis example where you you open the door and then shut it pretty quickly, because I think what you said was, oh, I'm really sorry if I was grumpy in that match. I hope it didn't affect you. You're kind of acknowledging the issue, but then you are removing the ability for them to go much further in polite society to say, you know what, actually, it really did affect me. So you're kind of trying to get a pass, not the same as asking for feedback.
Right. Okay. So what should what should I do though? Okay, but anyway, go on. Tell me about the clinical example. But tell me a bit more.
Well, actually, because they're both linked. They're both linked. So in the clinical example, possibly a slightly more effective approach, because you're saying, let's think together about ways in which I can improve this. But then you finish, I think, with a closed question, which was, is there anything else I could do to do better? So then the answer is yes or no. Most people put on the spot will say yes or no. So I think the key to both of those situations is asking an open question and asking it from the perspective of impact, because actually that's what we're talking about with feedback. We're talking about, when I do this, how does that make you think or feel? And how is that experience feel? Is it overwhelmingly positive or negative? So in the tennis example, how does my mood on court affect your mood, and how does it affect your performance?
Yeah, so that's a much better way of putting it. Yeah. But slightly frightening though.
For you, yes, I imagine. Yeah, because they might turn around and say, you know what, every time you get grumpy, I get scared.
Yeah.
And then I get scared and I shut down, and then I'm really bad at tennis. So actually playing with you makes me feel as if I'm really bad at tennis. So yes, you might hear.
And then I would follow up with, but you're really bad anyway. Which is the wrong thing to say.
Yeah, that's not my advice at all. So I think the key here is open questions but being willing to hear what they're saying, but helping them out by the kind of the impact thing. And that's the thing. So asking for feedback anyway, try and give somebody a steer. So rather than just saying, what do you think of my performance? Saying, I'm really trying to work on my use of open questions. How did you find that during the session? Or it's giving them a bit of help. And, the tennis one, you give them an example because it's your behavior. And in the clinic example, maybe it's, how do you find my manner during our consultation?
Okay, so let's go back to the consultation one. Yeah, but the trouble with the consultation one, if I'm too specific, my manner, there's all sorts of a million and one different aspects of the consultation I could ask. Could we just stay a little bit, because I'm finding this very helpful, with how could I ask a better question at the end of the consultation to get feedback? Because if I just go with, how did you find my manner? There's a lot of other things they may not have liked. How could I just capture? Could I leave it with, how did you feel about the consultation? Is that a better thing than it's anything I could change?
Well, I guess the question is, what are you looking for feedback on?
Well, everything.
You ask the question.
It's tricky.
What's
it's
the information you're after.
Okay. Yeah, any aspect.
So what goes into everything, such as?
Well, did they feel welcomed? Often it's the first consultation I'm asking. By the fact that they've come back again and again and again, by the 20th time they've come back, you're getting. They kind of, you can't be that terrible, right?
Just to have a better option. But yeah.
You are brutal. Anyway, at the end of the first consultation, I want to find out if they felt welcomed, because it's always scary and upsetting and unpleasant, and also whether they felt comfortable and whether they felt I was paying attention, and I was taking them seriously, and also whether they felt that that there was not just an understanding of the problem, but an advocation of a solution that made sense, that they could see a way out, that I was delivering a way out, if you see what I mean. And the other thing that happens is my style is somewhat direct, and whether they didn't mind that, the directness. Because a lot of people, in my opinion, want tea and sympathy in therapy. They want sympathetic understanding and kindness, as opposed to let's do something about this problem. There seems to be a distinction between the two, although they shouldn't really be. But they often feel that if you're moving to let's think of how do we solve this problem, you haven't spent enough time being sympathetic. And what I find interesting is a lot of people say quite quickly, no, all my friends are sympathetic. I don't need sympathy. What I need is a problem-solving approach. I think there's a tension, in my view, between a problem-solving approach, which is let's do something about this, and the kind of reassurance, what I call empty reassurance you get from friends who say, don't worry, you'll be fine. I'm sure you will get the job, although you just described a nightmare job interview, that kind of thing. The kind of empty reassurance friends do reflexively, which is it's all fine, you'll be okay. Don't worry about it. Yes. It's empty reassurance because it's based on nothing other than let me try to help you feel a little bit better in the short term. Anyway, so I don't know if I've given you enough information there about what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so if I was,
what I'm worried about.
If I was thinking, actually starting from the very beginning, question one for you, if you really wanted to have this conversation, is how willing to change your approach and style would you be if you got feedback that the one you're using currently isn't working from, a proportion or an understandable proportion of your client base? Because you're kind of, when you ask the question, you have to be ready for the answer. And the way in which you've described it, it sounds that, a hallmark of your approach is quite a direct, I'm not here for tea and sympathy approach. But so that's kind of consideration one. But putting that to one side and assuming that actually you are really interested and you would potentially change your style of approach given the feedback, then I don't know the answer, but I would probably start with a sense of expectation. So if I was speaking to a patient or a client, what was your expectation coming into this? How did you feel? And then how did the way in which the session unfold impact that expectation? And try and keep the questions open, so that you don't close them down on did you feel welcomed, but try and get them to talk about what they were expecting. And most people in that situation will probably talk to you about, well, maybe I felt a bit nervous, or I didn't really know what this was about, but actually explained to me really at the beginning that it was very clear and I knew what I was doing in the room. And then the way in which you talked to me, I felt really comforted and safe, fill in the blanks. So I would probably, in that situation, go from the starting point to where you are now. But there will be a million different and probably much better ways to get to it than that.
So I should say, what was your expectation? And then I should say, and how did you feel?
So, yes, what were you, how were you feeling before the session? What were you thinking? How did you think this was going to go?
Mm-hmm.
And then now we've had the session, where are you now?
Yeah. Okay. So that's very helpful. I think this is executive coaching in action, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
Kind of.
sending my bell.
So, in terms of this conversation, I think this is executive coaching in action because I clearly have a goal, which is to improve the way I get feedback at the end of the consultation. And I'm asking you for help.
Okay.
In other words, I have a clear sense of a goal and I'm asking your advice. And is that one of the issues that people need to be clear about their goal in coaching? Or is that not an issue? Because it seems to me that one of the deeper problems is many people come into therapy not entirely sure what they want, but feeling that what therapy is people being sympathetic and kind and listening. Whereas therapy can be many things, but the current vogue in therapy is let's clarify what the goal is and let's work towards the goal. And the other thing that's very in vogue at the moment, but wasn't so 50 years ago, is to be concrete and specific. So classically in marital therapy, for example, you will say to the couple, what's your goal? And the wife will say, I want him to be kinder, right? And then what you do now is you say, well, how could he, what could we use as a signal that he is being kinder? Okay, because if we just leave it as we meet next week and I ask you, has he been kinder? You'll go, no. And he will throw up his arms in despair and say, but I've been trying really hard to be kinder. Because what we need is a concrete, publicly verifiable event that has to happen, that we can agree has happened, that signals kindness. And this is really interesting at this moment because they both look at you a bit blankly. And then eventually she will say something like, if he helps me hoover the house and takes the trash out, then that means he's being kind. You see what I mean? And then, so we've operationalized kindness, and that kind of is the vogue at the moment. You've got to operationalize it so it's a publicly verifiable event. Has he hoovered the house? Has he taken the trash out? There's no debate. It either has happened or it hasn't happened. Anyway, what are your thoughts? Because a lot of people don't like that. They don't like the operationalization of these concepts like kindness.
Okay, so from an exec coaching perspective, there's two parts to that, because right at the very beginning, in a lot of executive coaching engagements, there's a third person. So there's you, the coach, there's your client, and then there's the organization or the stakeholder. And that operationalizing of the goal, which I just
operationalizing.
English is my first language. Yes, that
is it really operationalizing the concept of kindness so that we can measure it. We can be clear what we're referring to when we refer to kindness. It's called operationalizing. The term.
Okay, so I'm not going to use that word again because for some reason I've lost that cognitive ability. But that process belongs at the very, very start of a coaching engagement normally, and it's the third party. So in marital counselling, obviously you've got two people in the room. In coaching one-on-one, you've got me and the client. So you do get that third party input at the very beginning of a coaching engagement, and it's the kind of the role of the coach to say to the third party, from your perspective as the sponsor of this coaching, what are the changes you would like to see as a result of it? And because coaching obviously is entirely confidential, their ability to articulate what those changes are is the only way in which they're going to know really whether this coaching is having the effect they'd like it to. So you have to try and get that person to speak in terms of behavioral change, which is exactly what you've said. So rather than take the trash out, in executive coaching, we're normally talking about changes maybe to somebody's leadership style or the way in which they're interacting with their team. And you need to get that sponsor to be very, very clear about what those changes are. And then once you've got that then informs the goal of the coaching engagement, which unlike therapy is normally, it's a finite period of time. So it's sort of 6 to 9 months maybe. And it is very goal oriented. I mean, that's the whole point of coaching, is there is a goal. So there's a broad goal for the engagement, and then each session has a goal. And it will in some way relate to the broader goal. But you're quite right in that quite often what happens in reality is clients come into the room and they say, oh, I haven't thought about today at all. What do I need to talk about? And a lot of the first part of the coaching session, so say a session's 90 minutes, you can spend 30 to 40 minutes working with the client to understand from them what they need out of that 90-minute session. And that is the goal. And if you don't have that, then you're kind of lost, because you come, certainly as the coach, I come out of the session thinking, I don't know where we got to. And clients can find that process really painful, because quite often they'll come in and they talk to you about a symptom. And then actually the goal, the thing they really want out of the session, is sort of buried beneath a whole range of different symptoms. But if you don't have the goal, then you don't really have an effective coaching session.
So let's talk about let's talk about an example now, which I think is a very gory one, which is how to be likable, because I think that this carries people a long way in their careers. So at a job interview, and I give a lot of people advice over job interviews, people are key, and performance in a job interview is key to career success. And people are often bad at job interviews because I think one of the primary tasks in a job interview is to be likable. Because if you're liked, then you're halfway there. You've got to be able to convey the notion that you're competent as well, obviously, and that you're passionate, etc., etc. But being likable, in my opinion, seems to be a skill people are rapidly losing, or not even understanding that that's the bedrock. Start by figuring out how to be likable, and then also move on into the other bits about communicating that. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that, because that's a key social skill. It helps people with job interviews. It also tends to help people managing other people, getting on with other people, because the starting point is to be likable, in my opinion. I'd be interested in your opinion. And a lot of problems that people are having in the workplace or being successful in life, generally speaking, comes down to this issue and other aspects of social skills, how to conduct themselves with other people. Again, what are your thoughts about that point?
So I certainly get the fear when we think about likability in a professional context, because I think actually sometimes that as a goal is where people get into trouble, because quite often their role in their organization is not to be likable, it's to do, is to perform at a high standard and get the job done. And if they go down the route of wanting their team to like them, quite often they don't get the business outcome that they need. So I would normally talk more about respect and expectation management and consistency of emotional behavior, rather than does the person I'm working with want to go for a drink with me after work? Because I think likability is just a strange lens, because in a work context, we're not talking about, people have friends at work, of course they do, but it's a slightly different field. So I think it's more about, are you behaving in a way that matches the expectations of you and your values and how you'd like to behave at work? And are you behaving in a way that's consistently understood by those people around you, rather than do they like me?
Well, I agree with you that at the workplace and elsewhere in life, people want you to be effective. Okay. But I also think that this extra X factor is important. You could be interviewing 10 people who are all pretty effective and communicating effectiveness for a job, but the one who'll get the job, and I think there is some psychological research that might support this contention, is the person that people like. In other words, there's an emotional tone to relationships, and likability is in that area of the emotional tone. We have to be able to connote positive emotions in other people. That's what likability is about. Again, what are your thoughts?
Honestly, I don't know, because I don't know how you can teach likability, because I think it is such a personal choice. Do I like this person or not? And I think more and more in interviews, they're trying to move away from a situation where the interviewer is just basing their choice on whether they like this person. And it's much more based on, how does this person fit into the role and what could they bring to the organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I'm always a bit nervous about talking about likability, because it feels to me as if it's very, very personally held. I might like someone you don't like, but that's no judgment on their competence or their ability. And I would be very nervous about working with somebody on their likability, because in case it was my reflection of likability.
Well, we're right slap bang in the middle of this very interesting territory about this notion of social skills. And you could be saying, well, all that people need to do is to be competent socially, and maybe that's what we're saying. But I think there's a sense in which, let's take an example. I mean, there's a large group of people who are what we call socially phobic or socially anxious. So interviews make them anxious. Speaking in public makes them anxious. But walking into a party or a room full of 20 people at a cocktail party or a reception and they don't know anyone, they're very anxious about this task that we all have to face in life of walking up to a stranger and starting a conversation. Right. And for people who are anxious about that, social skills training, and there's a thing called social skills training, suggests have a plan and there's certain techniques. And the one famous technique about how to initiate a conversation with strangers is the compliment and question technique. Pay someone a compliment and then ask them a question. Okay. So if we were doing it now, I would go, well, what an interesting room you're in, for example. I'm assuming that I know now that may not be your room, but I mean, if it was your room, I'd go, what an interesting choice of art behind you. That's a very interesting picture. Where did you get that? Right? That would be a compliment and question approach. So the compliment and question approach, in my opinion, is very powerful because it doesn't really matter how you begin, but you've got to begin somewhere. And that's something that's a nice starting point for people who are a bit anxious and not socially assured. So I think there is a thing called social skills. I think there are techniques and they help people engage with each other and people can improve in that area. And I find, for example, the compliment and question technique, although it's a bit clunky and everyone knows what's going on when you start a conversation with compliment and question, but it's a way in and people just need a way in, I think, often. Anyway, again, what are your thoughts?
So I think two things. I think one is my approach probably comes from social skills is kind of the outcome, but the starting point would be, okay, so say you are one of those people, I think as you described, who no problem walking into a room of 20 people at a party, but total freeze at the idea of going to a job interview. Rather than focusing on likability, bearing in mind there will be tools and techniques, I guess the first bit would be trying to make sure that somebody gets out of their own way, so that whatever it is about that situation that makes them really, really nervous, they manage that nervousness and that anxiety. And so that they are able to be their best selves on the day and they don't walk out of the interview thinking, oh God, I don't think they saw the best of me. So I think that's probably the starting point. And that would also apply then to going to a networking event, which I personally hate as well. And thinking, how do I enter this social situation and not make a complete fool of myself? And then, yes, tips like compliment and question. I probably come back to a coaching approach, which is always, open, non-directive questions. Ask somebody something beginning with how, show interest, listen attentively, and use that kind of approach. But always my starting point, rather than sort of likability, is much more, okay, well, how do you walk into that room feeling as if you're really confident? You might not love it, you might not like the situation, but how do you walk in there thinking, okay, I think I know how I can do a good job for myself here?
That's a very interesting concept you said. How do we help people get out of the way of themselves? Tell us a bit more about that. I thought that was very interesting. In other words, you're saying, how do we help people be less anxious as well? So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah,
Well, they may be two different things.
I think anxiety quite often then is the result. So I think a lot of coaching, certainly a lot of the coaching I do, is around how people's thinking patterns are inhibiting them because they're stuck in these kind of old versions of themselves. Like, I can't do this. Like, I'm doing a science degree at the moment. I must spend at least 80% of my time thinking I can't do it. But that's based on when I was 11 years old and I'm now 47. I can do it. But as soon as I think I can't do it, then actually my ability to do it significantly reduces. My cognitive skills are absent at that point because I start to feel very, very anxious. And as soon as I start to feel anxious, I can't think straight. I get a bit hot, I get a bit flustered, I feel a bit sick. Then I start to think, oh my goodness, I really can't do it, because it's emotional reasoning. Like, oh my, there's something to be anxious about. And before I know it, I'm absolutely miles away from doing the task in front of me. So helping people, understanding with somebody how they are thinking about something and helping them get to a point where they're thinking about it in a way that is going to have a more positive rather than anxiety inducing outcome is a massive part, or I think, of coaching, and I would imagine of your job too, because it's that internal monologue narrative that can be so strong, and based on ancient assumptions and rules and stuff that you said about yourself maybe 30 years ago, but you've never challenged.
Tell us a bit more about that internal monologue and how you might go about changing that.
So I think people tend to think, they sort of have I always think, have you got a dictator in your head or have you got a cheerleader? And most of us have a dictator in their head. You know, you're not good at this, you can't do this, this is going to go wrong. And then that dictator is normally a star in their own Netflix show. So people are maybe nervous about something happening. You know, I get nervous about work, for instance. Let's use me as an example. I get nervous. I've done this job for 7 years. What happens if next year suddenly I have no client? And, you know, I'm slightly joking, but it probably wouldn't take me long to start thinking, oh my goodness, you know, if I have no clients, if. And suddenly I'm in this kind of awful movie where my life is unraveling and I haven't got a revenue and blah, blah, blah. And as soon as you start doing that, you start feeling anxious. And then the voice, the dictator voice, gets louder and louder and louder. And this sort of internal monologue of, no, maybe I really shouldn't do that. Or maybe I'm really not very good at my job. Or maybe this is going to happen, gets louder as well. But we all think that the voice in our heads is real. And we never question it. We just think, well, of course I believe what I think. Of course I do. Why would I believe anything else? And it's the loudest voice most of us listen to, and quite often that voice is wrong or has got a very different slant on it. And actually a lot of what you can do in coaching or in therapy is think about, okay, well, how is someone talking to themselves? What's the language they're using? Because as you well know, every word you use is likely to have an emotional response in somebody. And so helping people recognize that the way they talk to themselves is probably directly affecting the way they feel and therefore the way they behave. It's pretty basic, but I think it's a huge part of kind of personal and professional development.
I agree. I think, though, that people want change. They want to walk into a room and feel more confident, and they want you to remove the anxiety. But they're a bit addicted, in my experience, to that voice in the head and that internal monologue. And when you challenge it and argue with it, you make some progress, often in a session. But by the time you meet them a week later and they're having the session again, the voice returns and hasn't changed. I'll give you one classic example of many clients who are socially phobic or socially anxious, is their voice in their head is saying, I'm not as good as other people here at this, i.e., you know, social performance. I went to the wrong kind of school. I went to the wrong kind of university. All these other people here went to elite institutions. They're socially assured. They're more intelligent than I am. And it's blindingly obvious that, you know, I kind of like don't belong. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's roughly the flavor of what many people are thinking. So then you go through the thing for the hour of the consultation of challenging that and explaining how that's extremely unhelpful. And then they return a week later and they're also kind of in the same place. Now, what the other thing I'm going to say, which I know you're going to run screaming from the room over, is the other thing I do is I say, okay, let's just assume you're right. Okay, let's just go with what the internal voice is saying. Okay, you're right. You don't belong. Now, what do you want to do? Okay, don't try to enter this world and be at this place if you're arguing with yourself. You don't belong. Okay, let's just go with it. You're right. You don't belong. Just for the sake of the conversation. Now, what do you want to do? Where does that go? Because what's happening, and that's called Socratic questioning, you don't dispute things with people. You just go, let's just assume you're right. What's the next logical implication of that position? Because usually what's happening is they end up in an intellectual cul-de-sac or an emotional cul-de-sac, or it's hopelessness and despair. It goes nowhere. But what's really interesting, and Freud was very interested in this question, why do people do that? Why do they have a belief system that goes nowhere but somewhere bad and then stick to it relentlessly? Anyway, well, again, what are your thoughts about how to get people to change that? Because I think it's a tough $1 million question. And even CBT, which is the modern panacea, only the evidence is only 30% of people benefit from CBT. Everyone keeps going, it's an evidence-based therapy and it's the best therapy. But actually the cure rates are very low by and large. They may be better than many other things, but they're relatively speaking low. So this issue of how we get people to change their internal dialogue, no one, as far as I'm aware, has the magic answer yet. Everyone's coming at it, with different solutions or possible solutions. So anyway, I'll tell you what I think my solution is in a moment, but what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, so this is clearly not going to be the magic answer, but my personal perspective on this is that when somebody is in front of you or in a situation without you there, in an anxious state, asking them to use cognitive tools to get themselves out of that state is quite a big ask. So when you say to somebody, okay, your internal monologue is telling you you're not very good at this job, you need to now fight back that monologue and tell them to shush. That's kind of the issue, because your internal negative voice is always going to be more articulate and come up with more and more reasons than your kind of slightly quieter, more rational voice. So rather than engaging in the debate, I think possibly a different approach is to say, I'm not even going to get into the debate, because that just, you go down this cul-de-sac, this rabbit hole of more and more feelings and more anxiety. Instead, you recognize that the debate is happening and then you remove yourself from it. I don't mean physically, although sometimes maybe that is the case. But I would focus much more on tools to calm somebody's anxiety system down, recognize they're a state of anxiety, step one. Step two, okay, so how do you manage anxiety? How can you bring your levels back down to neutral? And for that, I would normally reach for, a fairly basic breathing exercise, or depending on who it is, maybe some sort of mindfulness meditation. Because in my own personal experience and in the experience I've seen, cognitive tools in an emotional fight are pretty weak, and they're easily overcome, because there's nothing worse than that feeling of abject terror. And you telling yourself you're going to be okay, in my experience, has certainly never worked. The only thing that gets me through a plane ride without crashing the captain and saying, I think I know better here, is a bit of mindfulness.
So when you say mindfulness, what do you mean? Can you tell us a bit more? Now, the breathing thing you're referring to is a classic breathing technique of focusing on your breathing and slowing your breathing down, often to count as you breathe. So count a certain number as you breathe in to help slow your breathing down. People can vary what the count is. Often there's an inhalation, then there's a count while you hold the breath, which is normally a bit shorter than the count of the inhalation, and then there's a long exhalation. The exhalation should be much longer than inhalation, maybe as long as the time of the hold and the inhalation. And that counting provides a focus to distract you from the anxiety thoughts, and also just slowing your breathing down, and also seeing that the theory is seeing that you can control your breathing gives you a bit of confidence. You have some control over your life in general. Anyway, over to you. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, so I think that's right. So I think broadly your exhale should be longer than your inhale, because from what I understand, you're calming your parasympathetic nervous system. So you will feel more relaxed than when you breathe in, you feel quite tight. When you breathe out for longer, you should feel a bit more relaxed. And the counting, it's a distraction, because you can't think about two things at once. You can't count 1 to 6 and think about what might happen. I think the kind of the mindfulness aspect that goes on top of the breathing is what is actually happening here and now. Because a lot of us, when we're having an anxiety moment, are either reflecting backwards on something that's already happened, or we're living in the future. What if? And it's the what if-ing, the scenario, the kind of Netflix movie that's causing the emotional response in the here and now. And that's the bit that you're dealing with. But the more you feel it, the more real it feels. So the mindfulness aspect is, okay, so what is happening here and now? Breathing is kind of step one, because you're breathing here and now. But then there are other techniques, 5 things I can see, 5 things I can smell, 4 things I can touch, to try and get someone to come back to where their feet are, rather than what they're doing, which is running a kind of a disaster movie in their head, 99% of which hasn't happened yet. So I think for me, that's the mindfulness aspect, which goes on top of the breathing.
That's very, very good. Could you say a bit more about that? Just run over what you said. So 5 things I can see, 5 things I can smell, 5 things I can touch. Is that roughly speaking what you're saying? So trying to bring people back into the present, i.e., where am I now? I'm not actually in that unemployment future that you painted for yourself of being an executive coach and having no clients in a year's time. I'm not actually in that future. I'm here and now in this present moment. That bad disaster hasn't actually happened yet. Is that what you're saying?
So this podcast has not yet, I hope, ruined my career. But
sorry to remind, well, you brought it up.
I know.
You're worried about having it.
So I think it's actually a rumination exercise, for people who are constantly thinking over and over again. And I have been given this by somebody else, but I think it's 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, maybe, and 1 thing I can taste. So you're basically tapping into each of your 5 senses, and obviously all of those 5 senses are rooted in the present, and you just run it again and again and again. And I use it when I'm flying, because I wasn't joking about the flying thing, because it takes me 2 seconds to think that I'm going to be on the news at 10, and it as a result of a plane crash. Yeah. Oh, I'm writing letters to my parents in my head, but it's horrendous.
As the plane goes down.
I can bring yes, obviously the plane isn't going down. Obviously we're circling at 35,000 feet and everyone else is absolutely fine, but I am not. I am absolutely convinced this is my last couple of seconds. And it doesn't really matter what I know about aeronautical engineering, which isn't much. The only thing that gets me through that is some reminder of what's actually happening here and now, rather than believing this, getting out of my head, basically. Out of my head and into here and now.
Okay, well, I think that's very impressive. But I think that the people who are socially anxious or any anxiety, and I think these techniques are useful. I'm not disputing that. I think ultimately all the cognitive stuff and the emotional stuff is there for an evolutionary reason, which is to produce a behavior, and the behavior is an avoidance, right? So I'm anxious about social situations, or I'm anxious about dating or whatever, therefore I won't do it, and the treatment is to go and do it. So the treatment in general is to perform an action. And I think one of the grave dangers of coaching and therapy is that there's money to be made by having conversations with people, because you charge money for the conversation, but it's not the conversation that gets people better. Though, by the way, talking to you has been very therapeutic for me today. It's actually the case that what they have to do is go away and perform an action. And often what happens is they keep with the avoidance, right? They keep coming back and seeing you because they believe they're working on themselves by doing the consultation, but they're missing the point. The consultation is only part of what's going to get people better. What's going to get people better is they have to go away and act in a different way. And that is the difficult bit, because they love talking to the warm, cuddly you, and but they don't want to go away and then implement the change, which is the crucial bit. And I think a lot of therapy actually begins to collude, and maybe coaching collude with the avoidance, because it becomes a complicated part of the avoidance. I've seen patients who've been in psychoanalysis, for example, just to use that one, for 20 years. And they've been successfully avoiding an action. Like they've been spending 20 years talking to the psychoanalyst about how terrible their husband is, okay, rather than just leaving the guy. It was the action they should be taking, but they didn't take the action, and it made them comfortable staying in a situation when actually the solution was kind of blindingly obvious, which is perform an action. And I think that at the heart of coaching and therapy, the action people need to take is usually blindingly obvious. What's going on, and more interesting, is why is it that blindingly obvious is not blindingly obvious to the person at the center? So what are your thoughts about that? That ultimately people need to go and perform an action, and they are resistant to it, and therapy sometimes colludes with not doing the action.
So I think this is where coaching and therapy are very different, actually. So I think people come to coaching normally with an action in mind. They have a change in mind. It might be minute. It might be, I wish I could spend more time at home and less time at work. I wish I got on with my team better. I would like to be promoted next year. But there's some sort of change that's in their head. Now, it's either they've got that goal, or, as we spoke about earlier, their organization would like them to use coaching to do something differently. So from the very get-go, it's action-oriented. But The difference, I think, is that as the coach, I don't have the solution and I don't have the judgment. So I don't have a view on what's right or wrong or what my client should do. And actually, I have to, obviously, there are times where I'm talking to a client and I think, oh, I know what you should do because I've been in this situation. But actually, the whole point of coaching is for the coach not to superimpose their experience onto the client. And the power of the coaching is through the questioning and through the process, the client starts to gain insight about what's going on for them and what they'd like to do next. And the result of that is that any actions they agree or they discuss or say, I'm going to do, they are much more likely to do because it's come from them. So it's completely different from getting advice. Like, to go right back to the beginning when you were talking about somebody losing weight, you know, if I say to my husband, I really wish I'd lose some weight, he'd just say, well, stop eating so much and go to the gym. Well, thanks very much. Yes, thank you. So that's advice, right? Advice is easy. It's pretty obvious. You know, the last thing a client who comes to see me needs is my advice on their situation based on the nanosecond that I've spent with them. What they need is a questioning environment, which can be quite challenging. So I'm not saying it's sort of always warm and cuddly, but it's an environment in which they can think about things differently, explore different options, and gain insight into their own behavior so that they get to the point where they think, actually, you know what, I'm going to do this differently, or this is what I'd like to do. And because they own it, they are then 100% more likely to do it than if I'd said to them, this is what I think you should do.
But I think now this is where we may have a bit of a fight. I think that you're appealing to the healthy part of people. I think for coaching to work, there has to be a healthy part of them that desires change. And I think sometimes this happens maybe in therapy, but can't happen in coaching, given what you've just said, that people have to arrive with a sense of a change. There isn't a sense in which there is a healthy part of someone. What they're pursuing is deeply dysfunctional. They could be a heroin addict. They could be performing in a dysfunctional way at work, but they have no interest in change. And so there's a part of what you're doing that is in contact or an appeal to the healthy part of people. And many people do have a healthy part of them, but a lot of people don't have a very healthy part of them. People who are very overweight have no interest in really becoming healthy, often waste a lot of the NHS's time because the NHS's time is spent giving them advice, but they actually have no interest really in being healthy. There's an idea we have that people are interested in health. Very often they're not. There's other things like having a good time or having a party, enjoying the warm rush of heroin through their veins, etc., etc. So a lot of what you're doing is appealing to the healthy side to people, but many people have no healthy side, or the healthy side's very, very small. Again, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that executive coaching is predicated on a mentally healthy client. So, you know, I'm not clinically trained. I don't have a clinical practice. I'm an executive coach who works inside organizations on people's leadership and their performance. And the prerequisite for that is that they are mentally healthy. So they have a healthy part of their brain and they are actively engaged in this process. Now, that's not to say that I don't meet clients where I, on speaking to them a couple of times, become concerned that actually they're not mentally healthy. And of course, this has increased exponentially since the pandemic. So I bump into anxiety or anxiety behaviors the whole time. But the expectation of coaching works when the person's mentally healthy. It happens that I'm quite interested in anxiety and that kind of thing. But I have a duty of care if I have a client who I think is anxious to try and direct them to somebody like you for support, clinical support in managing their anxiety or their depression or whatever it may be. So I think it is very different because coaching is about change and it's about change in healthy people. But I probably borrow quite a few techniques from, from therapy when I'm thinking about emotions and behavior and that kind of thing. But I'm managing it in somebody who's a healthy person, healthy client. Mentally healthy.
So one of the things you're interested in, and we're running out of time a little bit, just to warn you, we've got about 5 minutes left because the time just rushed by. It's been very interesting talking to you. You're very interested in the link between the physical body, the brain, the neuroscience, and psychology, and the way people act. And we were having a conversation before we've been talking live, as it were, now about about this issue. And I've said to you that Freud believed that looking inside the brain, doing neuroscience research, doing brain scanning research to find the source of where depression is or the human predicament is looking in the wrong place. He believed that the correct place was in the engagement of people with each other. So your husband treats you badly or your wife treats you badly and you're going to get depressed as a result. And what needs to happen is you need to deal with that out in the world. You either leave the husband or you engage with the husband-wife problem. And that's the location of the problem, is in the interaction between people and in the psychology of the way people think about their predicament. It's not in the 5-HT2A receptor being too little or too big. And this has come back to haunt psychiatry recently. It's been in the news because the recent news story was about how antidepressants, which are operating on the neuroscience, and always this story repeats itself again and again, that the neuroscience intervention is always found actually in the end to be maybe not quite as effective as people had thought. And what they're not realizing is what's the alternative? The alternative is the Freudian view, not Freudian in the classic psychoanalytical sense, but the way we should be thinking about the human predicament is in behavior, relationships, and emotions, and the way people think about themselves and how they can deal with themselves, as opposed to looking inside the brain. But I think you disagree with that view. You think it is worth looking inside the brain. It is the correct place to look, as well as outside the brain.
So, So I don't think it's binary. So I think that it's your brain and your body and your behavior. So I think where people get confused is they think, they think about their mental health and their physical health as two separate entities. Whereas, for instance, you can have a situation where you're extremely stressed and you have eczema, or you're extremely stressed and you have IBS symptoms. And people aren't necessarily linking the two things, or even if they are, if they go and see someone, they go to their GP and the GP treats the tummy bit or they treat the head. They don't treat the both things together. And so I think it's this sort of separation of mental and physical health, which is slightly false, because I think actually if you start to think about yourself as a system and think, well, okay, how am I feeling? What I'm eating affects how I'm feeling, affects what I'm thinking. Then I think that's a slightly more, it's a more realistic approach. But on the pharmacological approach to depression, yes, I mean, as the little I know about it, huge question marks over whether or not the pharmacological intervention has an actual output rather than just a placebo effect. But I think it's the whole thing. So I wouldn't argue for one or the other. I'd argue for the whole picture.
So how do you deal with clients? Because again, frequently we're on the same page in terms of helping people deal with strong emotions. People are anxious and we're helping them calm down and be less anxious and engage in a predicament like an exam or a job interview or networking or being at work. And they often say, I can't do this. They often say, I can't control the way I think. They classically often say, I can't stop myself ruminating. Okay, there's a denial of the ability to take control. And I often remark, well, I'm finding it interesting you made it to the clinic today. I mean, there's a huge amount of control involved. You got out of bed, you dressed, you brushed your teeth, you got onto a tube. I mean, what was going on? Was it not the case that you were in control of yourself to deliver this outcome of arriving in the clinic? And then you announce you can't control your mind. But there was a huge amount of mental control involved in getting to the clinic, for example. So that's the kind of conversation I'm often having, where people go, I can't stop thinking about something. I can't do anything but feel this way in this situation. They deny that the territory exists for them to improve in that area of control. I don't know whether you experience that in your work, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think there's a kind of a clever questioning technique that I've borrowed from, I think it's Nancy Klein, where you remove the assumption. So you say, but what if you could control the way you felt? How would that feel? And that somehow, the way of asking that question somehow opens a different window in people's head, and they start thinking into the future rather than into the past. And they start saying, well, actually, if I could feel more confident in that situation, I'd be able to do X, Y, and Z. And then if you start helping them reframe or see a different perspective or a different future, there's kind of positive emotion attached to that. And if that gets larger and greater than the negative emotion they're feeling now, then that's one way of helping somebody start to think differently, is kind of to remove this assumption of I can or I can't, this binary choice. We're like, okay, well, what if you could? So if you knew you were going to be successful, what would you do? And then people say, oh, actually, I'd do X, Y, and Z. I think, there you go. But I did not invent that, but that does work.
Okay, well, that was a great place at which to end. So we've run out of time. So Alexandra Durnford, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank
the
you.
website, again, is www.byronandwilf.com. Alexandra, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank